What happens when Hollywood's most iconic tough guy meets America's most persistent news anchor in what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance? You won't believe what unfolds when Sylvester Stallone sits down with George Stephanopoulos on Good Morning America, and a conversation about his latest project transforms into an explosive confrontation that leaves the entire studio speechless. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of Good Morning America was supposed to showcase Rocky himself promoting his upcoming documentary series. But what viewers witnessed was something entirely different. From the moment Sylvester Stallone walked onto that pristine studio set, the tension was palpable. Stephanopoulos, known for his confrontational interview style, had clearly done his homework, and it wasn't about celebrating Stallone's legendary career. The morning started innocuously enough. Stallone, dressed in his signature black leather jacket despite the studio's bright lighting, settled into the guest chair with the confidence of a man who had faced down Ivan Drago and Clubber Lang. His weathered hands adjusted his collar as he flashed that familiar crooked smile to the cameras. But George Stephanopoulos wasn't interested in pleasantries. "Sylvester, thanks for joining us this morning," Stephanopoulos began, his tone already carrying an edge that seasoned viewers would recognize. "Your new documentary promises to reveal the real story behind your rise to fame. But there are some real stories that have never been properly addressed, aren't there?" Stallone's smile faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the host's face. "George, I'm here to talk about my work, my journey. That's what people want to hear about." "Is it though?" Stephanopoulos pressed, leaning forward in his chair with the predatory instinct of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Because our research team has been digging into some interesting discrepancies in your early career timeline. Specifically, the circumstances surrounding how you actually got the Rocky script to producers." The studio audience, initially buzzing with excitement at seeing the Philadelphia icon, began to sense the shift in atmosphere. Camera operators adjusted their positions, recognizing that this wasn't going to be the typical celebrity puff piece. Stallone's jaw tightened, a telltale sign that anyone who had watched his films would recognize as a warning. "The story of Rocky has been told 1,000 times, George. I wrote it, I believed in it, I fought for it. End of story." But Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. His years of political journalism had taught him exactly when to apply pressure, and he could smell vulnerability. According to several sources we've spoken with, including former United Artists executives, the narrative you've maintained about refusing to sell the script unless you could star in it might not be entirely accurate. Stallone's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles whitening. "Sources? What sources? People who weren't even there?" "People who were there, Sly. People who remember meetings differently than how you've described them in countless interviews over the decades." Stephanopoulos shuffled through papers on his desk with deliberate theatricality. "In fact, we have documented evidence that suggests you were never the studio's first choice for the lead role, and that your insistence on starring was actually a desperate move after other opportunities had fallen through." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Stallone's face flushed red, the same color that had painted his cheeks during those brutal training montages in the original Rocky film. But this wasn't a movie, and there was no inspiring soundtrack to carry him through this moment. "You're talking about things you don't understand, George. You sit behind that desk and you think you know what it was like for a struggling actor in the 70s, but you have no idea what I went through." Stephanopoulos sensed the crack in Stallone's composure and pressed harder. "What we understand is that there's a pattern here. Rocky, Rambo, even the Expendables franchise. You've built a career on presenting yourself as the underdog who fought against the system, but the reality is that you've been very skilled at manipulating that narrative." "Manipulating?" Stallone's voice rose, causing several crew members to look up from their positions. "I've never manipulated anything. I've worked my ass off for everything I've achieved." "Have you, though?" "Because we've also uncovered some interesting information about your military service claims, or rather, the lack thereof. You've allowed the public to associate you with military heroism through your Rambo character, but you never actually served, did you?" The question hit Stallone like a right hook from Apollo Creed. His face contorted with a mixture of anger and something else, perhaps shame, or maybe just the fury of a man whose carefully constructed public image was being dismantled on live television. "That's completely out of line," Stallone growled, his Philadelphia accent becoming more pronounced as his control slipped. "I never claimed to be a veteran. I played characters, George. I'm an actor. An actor who has received countless military honors and spoken at veteran events without ever correcting the record when you're introduced as someone who understands the soldier's experience." Stephanopoulos' voice remained steady, clinical, like a surgeon making precise incisions. "Don't you think that's somewhat deceptive?" Stallone stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and bumping into the backdrop. The sudden movement caught everyone in the studio off guard, including the camera operators who scrambled to adjust their shots. "I've supported veterans my entire career. I've raised millions for military charities. I don't need to justify my patriotism to you or anyone else." But Stephanopoulos wasn't finished. He had clearly prepared for this moment, and like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, he was building towards something bigger. "Supporting veterans is admirable, Sly. But there's a difference between support and appropriation, isn't there? Just like there's a difference between inspiration and fabrication." The studio fell silent, except for the low hum of cameras and equipment. Even the production assistants stopped moving, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Stallone stood there, 6 feet of coiled muscle and barely contained rage, staring down at the man who had just called his entire legacy into question. "You want to talk about fabrication, George? Let's talk about your fabrication of journalism. This isn't an interview, this is an ambush." Stallone's voice was dangerously quiet now, the calm before the storm that any fan of his films would recognize as the moment when Rocky decides he's taken enough punishment. Stephanopoulos reached for a manila folder that had been sitting ominously beside his coffee mug throughout the interview. The deliberate nature of his movements suggested this moment had been planned, choreographed even, like a final devastating blow in a boxing match. Stallone's eyes followed the folder with the intensity of a predator tracking prey, sensing that whatever was inside would either make or break this already explosive confrontation. "Before we continue, Sly, I want to show you something that our investigative team uncovered just yesterday." Stephanopoulos opened the folder with theatrical precision, his fingers dancing across what appeared to be old photographs and documents. "These are production stills from a film called The Party at Kitty and Studs, also known by its later title, The Italian Stallion. Ring any bells?" The color drained from Stallone's face so quickly it was visible even under the studio's harsh lighting. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. The film Stephanopoulos was referencing was Stallone's adult film from 1970, something he had done out of desperation when he was homeless and broke. It was a chapter of his life he had spent decades trying to bury. "That was 50 years ago," Stallone managed to whisper, his voice barely audible over the ambient studio noise. "I was starving, George. Literally starving." "Oh, we're not judging you for doing what you had to do to survive," Stephanopoulos replied with mock sympathy, his tone dripping with false understanding. "What's interesting is how you've systematically tried to have every copy of this film destroyed or bought up. That's a lot of effort to erase something that was just a job, don't you think?" Stallone's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The veins in his forearms became visible, pulsing with the rhythm of his elevated heart rate. "Some things should stay buried, George. Not everything needs to be dragged into the light for your entertainment." "But that's where you're wrong, isn't it?" Stephanopoulos pressed, his voice gaining momentum like a runaway train. "Because while you were spending millions trying to bury this film, you were simultaneously building a brand around family values and American heroism. Don't you see the contradiction there?" The studio audience began to murmur among themselves, a low rumble of discomfort that reflected the tension building on stage. Several audience members looked genuinely uncomfortable, as if they were witnessing something they shouldn't be seeing. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every micro-expression on Stallone's increasingly agitated face. "There's no contradiction," Stallone shot back, his voice rising to match Stephanopoulos' intensity. People change, George. People grow. That film doesn't define who I became, any more than your first job defines who you are now. Except my first job wasn't in pornography, and I didn't spend the next 5 decades pretending it never happened, while lecturing others about moral values. Stephanopoulos leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a chess player who had just announced, "Checkmate." How do you explain that to the millions of families who've watched your films with their children? Stallone took a step closer to Stephanopoulos' desk, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the host. The movement was subtle but unmistakably threatening, causing several security personnel positioned just off camera to shift their positions. You want to talk about moral values? What about the moral value of basic human decency? What about respecting someone's journey instead of trying to destroy them for ratings? I'm not trying to destroy anyone, Stephanopoulos replied coolly, though there was now a slight tremor in his voice that suggested he was beginning to realize he might have pushed too far. I'm simply asking questions that the public has a right to have answered. The public has a right? Stallone's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. The public doesn't have a right to every detail of my personal life. The public doesn't have a right to judge decisions I made when I was 24 years old and sleeping in bus stations. But Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. His journalistic instincts, honed through years of political combat, told him that Stallone was on the ropes, and this was the moment to deliver the knockout punch. What about the right to know that their hero built his fortune on a foundation of lies and cover-ups? What about their right to know that the man who portrayed ultimate masculinity and honor was willing to do anything for money? The words hit Stallone like physical blows. His face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: hurt, anger, betrayal, and finally, a cold rage that anyone familiar with his film characters would recognize as dangerous. The transformation was mesmerizing and terrifying to watch, like witnessing a volcano in the moments before eruption. "You son of a bitch," Stallone said quietly, his voice carrying a menace that seemed to fill the entire studio. "You think you're so much better than me, sitting there in your expensive suit, judging a man's entire life based on one desperate decision made half a century ago." Stephanopoulos sensed he had crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. "I'm not judging your decision, Sly. I'm questioning your dishonesty about it." "Dishonesty?" Stallone's voice exploded across the studio like a gunshot. "You want to talk about dishonesty? What about the dishonesty of ambushing a guest with material you know will humiliate them? What about the dishonesty of pretending this is journalism when it's really just character assassination?" The confrontation had reached a fever pitch. Stallone was now standing directly in front of Stephanopoulos' desk, his hands planted firmly on its surface, leaning forward until he was mere inches from the host's face. The cameras captured every detail of the moment: the sweat beading on Stallone's forehead, the slight recoil in Stephanopoulos' posture, the palpable electricity of two powerful men locked in mortal combat. "You think you're untouchable behind that desk," Stallone continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried more threat than his earlier shouting. "You think you can destroy people's lives and call it news. But let me tell you something, George. I've been through hell and back. I've survived poverty, rejection, and more failures than you can imagine. I've built something from nothing, and I'll be damned if I let some small man with a big microphone tear it down." Stephanopoulos tried to regain control of the situation, but his voice betrayed his growing unease. "Sly, I think we should take a commercial break and—" "No," Stallone cut him off sharply. "No breaks. No commercial. You wanted to do this in front of America, so let's finish it in front of America." He straightened up but remained standing, his presence dominating the entire set. "You want to know about that film? Fine. I did it because I was homeless and desperate. I've regretted it every day since, but I'm not going to apologize for doing what I had to do to survive." The studio had fallen completely silent, except for the quiet whir of cameras and the barely audible breathing of a captivated audience. Even the production crew seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let this unprecedented moment play out. Stephanopoulos, for the first time in the interview, appeared genuinely speechless. "But you know what I regret more than that film," Stallone continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. I regret coming on this show. I regret thinking that maybe, just maybe, there was still some integrity left in journalism. I regret believing that a man's life's work might matter more than some cheap gotcha moment designed to boost your ego. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. It was clear that something was about to break, that this confrontation had reached the point of no return. Stephanopoulos made one last attempt to salvage the interview, but his words would only serve to light the final fuse that would blow this entire situation apart. Sly, I understand you're upset, but this is exactly the kind of transparency the American people deserve from their celebrities, Stephanopoulos said, his voice carrying a condescending tone that would prove to be the final straw in an already explosive situation. You've made millions portraying heroes, and people have a right to know who you really are beneath that carefully crafted image. The words hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before Stallone's composure finally shattered completely. His face transformed into something primal, a look that transcended acting and tapped into decades of real-world struggle and frustration. The Philadelphia street fighter that he had channeled in Rocky wasn't a character anymore. It was the real Sylvester Stallone, stripped of Hollywood polish and media training. Transparency? Stallone roared, his voice echoing off the studio walls with such force that several audience members visibly flinched. You want transparency? Here's some transparency for you, George. You're not a journalist. You're a vulture. You feast on other people's pain and call it serving the public interest. Stephanopoulos tried to interject, but Stallone was just getting started. The dam had burst, and 50 years of Hollywood frustrations came pouring out in a torrent of raw emotion. You sit there behind your desk like some moral authority. But what have you ever built? What have you ever created? I've entertained millions of people, inspired countless individuals to chase their dreams, and given hope to underdogs everywhere. What have you done except tear people down? The studio cameras captured every moment as Stallone began pacing behind his chair like a caged animal. His movements were sharp, aggressive, punctuated by hand gestures that emphasized each point he made. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing something that felt more real than anything they had ever seen on television. You want to judge me for a film I made when I was desperate? Fine, judge away. But while you're judging, remember that I turned that desperation into Rocky. I turned homelessness into hope for millions of people. I took my lowest moment and transformed it into something that still inspires people 50 years later. Stephanopoulos, visibly shaken but still clinging to his journalistic persona, made another attempt to regain control. Sly, I think you're missing the point here. This isn't about judgment. It's about... Shut up, Stallone interrupted, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. Just shut your mouth for once in your life and listen. You think you know struggle? You think you understand what it means to fight for something? You've never had to choose between your dignity and your next meal. You've never had to swallow your pride just to survive another day. The confrontation had evolved beyond a typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This was something deeper, more primal, a clash between two very different philosophies about success, dignity, and the price of fame. Stallone continued his verbal assault with the intensity of a man who had finally decided to stop playing by Hollywood's polite rules. I'll tell you what real transparency looks like, George. Real transparency is admitting that you brought me here today not to promote my documentary, but to humiliate me. Real transparency is acknowledging that you get off on destroying people who've accomplished more than you ever will. Real transparency is admitting that this whole thing is about your ego, not serving the public. The crew members exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they should continue filming or cut to commercial. The producer, visible in Stallone's peripheral vision, was making frantic hand signals to wrap up the segment, but the actor was far beyond caring about television protocols. You know what the difference between you and me is, George? Stallone asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. When I was broke and desperate, I found a way to turn that pain into something beautiful. You take other people's pain and turn it into ratings. Stephanopoulos finally found his voice, but his words only added fuel to the fire. I understand you're emotional, but personal attacks aren't going to change the facts we've discussed today. Facts? Stallone laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only contempt. You wouldn't know a fact if it punched you in the face. You deal in innuendo, half-truths, and character assassination. You're everything that's wrong with media today. The confrontation reached its crescendo as Stallone moved closer to Stephanopoulos' desk one final time. His presence filled the entire frame of every camera angle, transforming him from a guest into the complete master of the situation. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Stephanopoulos now looked small and vulnerable behind his anchor desk, while Stallone commanded the space like the movie star he had always been. I came here today thinking I was going to have a conversation with a professional journalist about my work and my life, Stallone continued, his voice building to a thunderous climax. Instead, I find myself sitting across from a small, petty man who gets his kicks from ambushing people with their darkest moments. Well, congratulations, George. You got your moment. You got your ratings. But you know what you didn't get? Stephanopoulos stared up at him, unable to respond, trapped in the spotlight of his own making. You didn't get my dignity. You didn't get my spirit. And you sure as hell didn't get my respect. Stallone reached down and grabbed his jacket from the chair, pulling it on with deliberate, measured movements that spoke to his decades of on-screen presence. Because at the end of the day, I'm still Sylvester Stallone. I'm still the guy who wrote Rocky in 3.5 days. I'm still the guy who fought for his dreams when everyone said no. And you? You're just another talking head who'll be forgotten the moment they find your replacement. The studio erupted into chaos as Stallone turned his back on Stephanopoulos and began walking toward the exit. Crew members scrambled to follow him with their cameras, capturing every step of his dramatic departure. The audience, many of whom had begun applauding spontaneously, rose to their feet in what could only be described as a standing ovation for the departing actor. This interview is over, Stallone announced to no one in particular as he ripped off his wireless microphone and let it fall to the studio floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the speakers. And so is any respect I might have had for this network, this show, and especially for you, George. Security personnel moved to intercept him, but Stallone waved them off with a gesture that was both dismissive and surprisingly gentle. Don't worry, boys, I'm leaving. I wouldn't want to spend another second in the same room as that excuse for a journalist anyway. As he reached the studio door, Stallone paused and turned back one final time. Stephanopoulos sat frozen at his desk, clearly shell-shocked by the complete destruction of what was supposed to be a controlled interview. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the mechanical sounds of cameras still rolling and capturing every moment of this unprecedented television moment. You know, George, Stallone called out across the studio, his voice carrying easily in the hushed space. Rocky Balboa once said that it's not about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. Today, you hit as hard as you could, and I'm still standing. Can you say the same? With those final words, Sylvester Stallone walked out of the Good Morning America studio, leaving behind a shocked host, a stunned audience, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about television moments in recent memory. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing Stephanopoulos sitting alone at his desk, the scattered papers from his manila folder spread before him like the remnants of a battle he had clearly lost. The red recording lights finally dimmed, but the impact of what had just transpired would reverberate far beyond that studio, cementing this confrontation as the moment when Hollywood's most beloved underdog proved that he could still fight when it mattered most.